Hello, I'm Gabriel Montua. I'm the curator of the collection of Museum Berggruen.
And I'm Anna Wegenschimmel, the assistant curator of the exhibition.
We're standing here inside Museum Berggruen, presenting you a new exhibition called Picasso and Les Femmes d'Alger. We as the Museum Berggruen have one of the largest Picasso collections in the world. We regularly do exhibitions with Picasso, also trying to do what we call the time test, that is putting Picasso's work in context with artists from other times. We did this with the contemporary artists Thomas Scheibitz or George Condo, and now we chose an even larger time frame, almost 200 years of art history with Les Femmes d'Alger. Les Femmes d'Alger, in the title of our exhibition, what is it exactly? It's the title of 15 oil paintings and more than 100 drawings and prints that Picasso made in the winter of 1954-55. It is also the title of two world-famous paintings and a few drawings and sketches made by Eugène Delacroix in the 19th century. And finally, it is also the title, either completely or in parts, of some contemporary works. We are very excited to take you on a journey that will take you on 3 floors and that will show you everything around this exhibition.
Unfortunately, we cannot have this big opening event in our lovely Bettina Berggruen garden tonight, but instead we are taking you through a little online tour through the exhibition to give you an idea of our exhibition Picasso and Les Femmes d'Alger. So please follow us through the rooms and we hope that you will enjoy it.
This is where it all began. Les Femmes d'Alger dans leur intérieur. Eugène Delacroix's 1849 second version of a painting made after memories and sketches dating back to a brief stopover in Algiers 15 years earlier. When he visited, Algeria had just come under French colonial rule. Delacroix was introduced to a local dignitary's house who allowed him to visit the women's quarters. And even though he had just spent several months in Morocco, where he recorded a lot of his impressions, he was absolutely fascinated by the intimacy of the scene. 3 women of the house at rest, sharing a water pipe and being attended by a servant. Everything is so quiet and so softened, the lights are out, that you can almost hear the silence just by watching this painting. Straight after he presented his first version of the oil painting at the 1834 Paris Salon, the painting and the motif became extremely popular. Coinciding with the spread of European imperialism, there was a high demand by European audiences for Orientalist paintings, that is, depictions set in predominantly Muslim countries with scenes often exaggerated or freely invented for sensationalist reasons. But Delacroix really had been there himself. He made a lot of sketches on the spot, like this one on loan from the Louvre. With an ethnographer's acuteness, he recorded the colors of the garments and the names of the women that he portrayed. So later he added the watercolors, making it a work of art of his own sake, which was disseminated into individual sheets. Next to Delacroix's sketchbook is the sketchbook Picasso held in 1940. The first 5 pages sketch the painting by Delacroix with a handwritten mention Femmes d'Alger by Eugène Delacroix to avoid any doubt there could be. It's fascinating to see how both Delacroix's 2 19th century paintings and Picasso's mid-1950s series of 15 paintings can be traced back to these sketches on paper, so modest in size. In this very first sketch, it is that Picasso keeps as close to Delacroix's original as never again. Was Picasso the first artist to make a reply to Delacroix's iconic work? No. Henri Fantin-Latour was a great admirer of Delacroix and made this copy of the Louvre version about 12 years after Delacroix's death. We present this loan from Musée Delacroix for 2 reasons. Because it is one of the first replies to Delacroix, And second, because it is made after Delacroix's first version from 1834, the one that Picasso studied intensively in the Louvre. This way, our visitors can compare both versions and see the main difference. While in the earlier version, the figures are in the foreground, dragging the viewer into their intimacy, in the Montpellier version, Delacroix moved them to the middle ground. The effect of a theater stage was immediately noticed by critics, reinforced by the curtain that the servant holds open and which would now be in front of the woman instead of behind them. Although we know through his partner at the time, François Gillot, how Picasso frequently went to the Louvre to study the painting there, it is obvious that he also knew the Montpellier version quite well. You'll see in his paintings and drawings the octagonal table that only exists in Delacroix's Montpellier version. I would like to argue that Picasso was fascinated by Delacroix's shifting of the figures in between his two versions, that despite keeping the same motive, resulted in two very different paintings when you look at them closely. Picasso identified the potential latently inscribed in this moving of figures by Delacroix. He must have sensed the possibilities for works of his own if he freely adapted and further changed the figures and the overall compositions. This made him wish to create not only one single reply to Delacroix's iconic work, but a whole series in which he could try out as many possibilities as he could.
Since we've been planning the exhibition and looking extensively at depictions of the Femme d'Angers series, we always had a question in mind: why 1954? What drove Picasso so many years after his first sketches to finally take up the work on Delacroix's masterpieces and dive into a 3-month-long phase of extensive work? It seems that 3 separate events taking place in 1954 motivated Picasso to finally fulfill this wish. In this room, we tried to gather them. First, a new woman, Jacqueline Roux, which you can see on those 2 works, came into Picasso's life. They met a few months before at the Madura pottery where Picasso used to work. With her long characteristic neck and her long dark hair, she has a great resemblance to the seated woman in Delacroix's painting. In one of his first studies, dated 21st of December 1954, Picasso places Jacqueline on the right as one of the women of Algiers. Next to this biographical one, there's also a political motivation. 1st of November 1954 is said to be the official beginning of the Algerian War of Independence. Picasso was surrounded by media reports on the uprising war, and it is very likely that reports such as this one in the magazine Paris Match reminded him of Delacroix's painting. And last but not least, it was definitely the death of Henri Matisse, which motivated Picasso to work on the Femme d'Angers. His longtime friend and artistic rival died on 3rd November 1954, only a few weeks before Picasso was taking up his work on the series. There is this quote by Picasso that has become famous. In 1955, he told visitors to his studio while showing them the Femme d'Angers series, "When Matisse died, he left his odalisques to me as a legacy." And this leads us to the next room.
But what exactly are odalisques? The word etymologically comes from the word oda, Turkish Ottoman for private room, and designates a female nude in an intimate interior. It has a long tradition in Western art history, and even artists who are not predominantly known for their Orientalist subjects like Ingres or Manet have tried their hand at it. Matisse had worked throughout all his career the subject of the female nude. Matisse, who like Delacroix but unlike Picasso, had visited Morocco and Algeria, in the 1920s frequently painted his nude in Orientalist settings, thus turning them to odalisques. Picasso admired, envied, and teased Matisse for 2 qualities of his paintings: his coloring and the inventiveness of his anatomies. Although he was not a fan of Orientalist tropes, Picasso could not miss to see that Matisse made ostensible use of the Orientalist tradition to guide him in his coloring and his ornamental patterns. But Picasso was full of awe for the bold compositions and shapes in which he drew his nudes. These two paintings from Orangerie and Musée Matisse, Nice, are both odalisques, though very different. The one, called With the Red Trousers, is an extremely soft painting. The odalisque almost completely dissolves in the flowery patterns of the textiles at the back. In this one, called With the Red Box, the odalisque is much more present. The background pattern, though ornamental, is much more geometrical, the whole painting much more rigid. Picasso had been studying Delacroix at least 15 years and exchanged intensively with Matisse when they were neighbors on the Côte d'Azur in the post-war years. Suddenly, with the death of Matisse and helped by his encounter with Jacqueline and Algiers in the news, Picasso looked at Delacroix through the eyes of Matisse. Obviously, he did not want to make a copy of either Delacroix or Matisse. He wanted to move even further away from Delacroix than Matisse did. Let's go up on the first floor to find out what Picasso did. We are now on the first floor of the museum in the galleries dedicated to Picasso's series. The galleries are laid out in a full circle. We'll take you from one room to the next so that you'll be able to watch the artist at work as if you were looking over his shoulder. It took Delacroix 15 years to make a second version. Picasso, when he finally got ready, made two versions in one day on 13 December 1954. The first of them is here behind me on the left. We can see that Picasso focused only on the two sitting women in Delacroix, leaving out the one lying on the left. Picasso redesigned the servant as a waitress. This obviously changes the whole atmosphere of the scene, makes it a more lively place close to a coffee or a tea house, even though in traditional Arab societies women were not allowed into these places of conviviality. While Delacroix and also Matisse were eager to create a specific sensuous atmosphere recognizable as being located somewhere in the Orient, Picasso did not really care about these details. The Moorish arch, the water pipe and clothing are as abstractly rendered as a figurative representation allowed him. Still, we can make out that the woman sitting on the right wears green trousers, exactly like the one sitting on the right in Delacroix's painting and in the sketch. The same day, he repeated the painting with slight compositional changes as a grisaille, version B. And after those first two versions, did Picasso already have a more extensive series in mind? We can't say for sure. He kept working on the subject on paper and 2 weeks later made the third painting after Delacroix, version C. Here, he now takes in all four figures from Delacroix's original, though in terms of composition, he moves even further away. What we see is that we cannot really recognize which of the figures in Delacroix are now placed in the painting. What's for sure is that the posture of the one on the right is more reminiscent of a yoga studio than of a harem. As we have seen below, Matisse is just as present as Delacroix in Picasso's series. This bold move to turn one woman upside down is probably also inspired by Matisse, who in the late 1920s made several compositions with upside-down nudes, as art historian Susan Galassi was the first to point out. Before committing it to canvas, Picasso tried this posture out on paper on the very same day as he would paint version C. In another study present in this room, Picasso presented the entire composition he would paint 2 days later as version C, only that here the second woman from the right is small and chubby, whereas in the oil painting she is thin and elongated like a cactus. It is exactly this complementary, simultaneous views of paintings and preparatory studies that can realize what I said earlier about their aim to present you the artworks in such a way as if you were looking over Picasso's shoulder. Though one has to keep in mind that Picasso's oil paintings are something very close to elaborated studies themselves, as he was not searching for one specific result, not for the one answer to Delacroix, but was interested in trying out as many different possibilities as he could while working on this motif.
In this room we have the two versions E and F, dating from 16th and 17th January 1955. They are very similar in composition. Again, we have these 3 figures instead of 4. We have this large lying figure, which now takes up almost the entire foreground. On the left, there is again the water pipe smoking figure, frontally seated, and in the rear, the almost dancing servant pushing back the curtain with the one hand and serving tea, or is it coffee, with the other. Both versions are very strong in color. Version E, a very Matisse-like version, concentrates on the colors blue for the lying, red for the sitting, and green for the walking figure. Version F, on the contrary, is full of color shadings. If we take a close look on this version F, we can spot the beginning of a stairway in the background. This reminds us of Diego Velázquez's Las Meninas, which is of course no coincidence. A few years after the Femmes d'Alger series in 1957, Picasso also adapted the Velázquez masterpiece in a great series. So the entire Femmes d'Alger series is full of hints and references to other artists and artworks. Version F is the first version in which we can find this stairway. It will pop up again in some of the following versions. But what comes after the staircase innovation in version F? What's Picasso's next big move?
The next big move for Picasso was actually to significantly increase the size of his canvases for the next 3 works that he painted between 24 and 26 of January 1955. Significantly larger canvases, but still, of course, the same composition, only now in version J, again with all 4 figures. We recognize the table, which we said before was only in the Montpellier version of Delacroix. And another interesting feature, all the way on the left, is the Moorish arch from Delacroix that first was next to the woman, later in version E and F that we've just seen became something like a halo, and now is just like a pom-pom on a hat over the woman's head. What is the most interesting here, however, is what the eminent art critic and art historian Leo Steinberg put out as the main thesis for the whole series of Picasso. Namely, to paint a woman with a close contour in such a way that she would be at the same time lying on her back and on her stomach. And this is, from these versions on, we can start to identify what Steinberg means in Picasso's works. So if you take a look only at the head and the lower part of the upper body, it looks as if this woman would be lying on her stomach. Whereas if you look at the upper breast and the navel and of course the position of the legs, this gives you a woman lying supine. Basically, this whole idea of a simultaneous rendering of a figure in such a way that anatomy and perspective would never allow us is, according to Steinberg, the whole challenge of Picasso one of the major challenges in this whole series. And it is something that was not completely new to Picasso. Already, as early as 1942, Picasso painted this work from a collection called The Large Reclining Nude. Not really an odalisque, obviously inspired by the war years. We still recognize a lying woman, very plausible at first sight, but when you look at it with severe anatomical contortions. A woman supposed to be lying supine, it would not be possible to see her spine like you do here. But what is maybe even more strange is when you look at the feet. This one clearly is the left foot, as you can see by the row of toes. But if you follow this left foot, it ends in the right leg. So we see that the play of contortions, especially with the legs, this is something that will be extremely important in the Femmes d'Alger series. we already mentioned, Picasso said that he inherited the odalisque from Matisse. Indeed, the reclining nude as a painting or as a sculpture was one of Matisse's favorite subjects. In somewhat simplified terms, Picasso's speciality was design, the compositional outline of figures, while Matisse excelled in coloring. John Elderfield argued that Picasso's entire series is an imaginary dialogue he conducted with Matisse. As his friend Matisse was already dead, Picasso had to paint his part of the dialogue himself. Elderfield thinks that the colorful paintings we have just seen are Picasso's paintings à la Matisse, and that he will now reply in the continuation of the series with truly Picassian paintings. This is highly interesting, though obviously things are not always just black and white. Here we have Picasso's only watercolor from the series, one extremely beautiful and colorful work, another one à la Matisse, like the large one in the room before. But in the same room, we also have a drawing by Matisse, which just shows the outline of three female figures and leaves out colors altogether, though as if it would have been a work by Matisse made à la Picasso.
This is one of our favorite rooms, as viewing Picasso's version L on the back wall, together with the sculpture Femme accroupie by the Cubist artist Henri Laurence dating 1922 creates such a great atmosphere. They two fit together just perfectly. We always call this room the Pyramid Room for quite obvious reasons. The intention was to give the visitors an idea of the classical triangular composition that Picasso uses in depicting the smoker in version L. As a point of comparison, we included Picasso's study from 28th of December, where one can see that he thought of the woman in a very blocky style and that this symmetrical triangular composition was not at all planned from the beginning on. It gives the hint, once again, that Picasso's search for the perfect forms was in constant movement. In version L, Picasso isolates the woman holding the water pipe in her right hand from the other figures and honors her with a solar appearance in grisaille colors. The result is a monumental study of the smoker being almost symmetrical with her cross-legged sitting position. The painting was the starting point for this entire exhibition project. It is on permanent loan from the Berggruen family here in the museum. Regular visitors to the Museum Berggruen are probably very familiar with this one. And when Gabriel came up with the idea of once showing the painting together with its counterparts by putting it in its historic context, we were all very much intrigued. I think what makes this exhibition so special is that it is trying to create a new awareness of our seeing and perception in times where we are constantly flooded with images and consumerism. It invites people to have a very close look at the paintings, which are also similar and yet so different from one another. Our wish would be that the visitors take their time to compare the different versions with each other and discover all the details that led Picasso from one painting to the next one, to really see and understand what was driving him for so many weeks. And with this thought in mind, we invite you to follow us into the next room, the paper room. I won't get into too much detail about every work in this room, just let me give you some ideas what we think is interesting about them. For example, in these three drawings, all made by Picasso on the very same day, on the 7th of January, one can almost step into the head of the artist and understand what he was thinking about while sketching. His constant trying in finding the perfect form for the sleeping figure in the foreground. Right next to it, we have the earlier version of the same figure with much more details like the jewelry around her neck and her wrist. Interesting in this drawing is also the table standing behind the figure. If one looks closely, one can find a similar looking table in Delacroix's second version of the Femme d'Alger, which we saw in the very first room of the exhibition. Picasso takes it up and integrates it in different sizes and colors throughout the entire series. always on the right side of the scene. It almost feels like a little game Picasso is playing with this hexagonal table. Speaking of the interior in the femme d'argent scene, one element plays a particular role: the curtain. The servant in Delacroix's versions is drawing back a big, heavy curtain as if to open the stage scene and revealing the gaze on the harem scene. Picasso plays with this curtain in this etching by doubling it. The servant becomes really tiny, drawing back the heavy, thick curtain. On the foreground on the right side, however, there's a second translucent curtain which hides the legs of the sleeper. On this wall you can see 4 lithographs, all stemming from the same copper plate. Picasso defined the contours in the first one, dating 5th of February. Beginning with this first state, he edited the plate over the course of 6 weeks, with adding more and more details to the scene. This constant retrying and re-editing reflects quite well Picasso's approach to the series, also visible in this early drawing from December, where he tried to compose the scene in portrait instead of landscape format.
As we have just seen in the room before, for Picasso, the whole fun of working on the series was to always try out new arrangements. It is only in the final paintings that the 4 women take up their definite positions. Version N, on loan from the Mildred Kemper Art Museum of Washington University, St. Louis, still follows the cubist rendering of the woman from the earliest 3 grisaille versions, K, L, and M, though here color returns. According to Steinberg's thesis, Picasso's main focus was to show the sleeper simultaneously prone and supine. This works even better now, since he refrains from painting a face and just puts an empty ball for the head. And now to the final painting of the series, version O. It's an explosion of color and such a profusion of a painted surface, painted with so much attention, that one senses already from the beginning that this is the culmination of the whole series. It is also a compression of opposites into one harmonious whole. We have on the left the women is the most naturalistic in the entire series, also in terms of dress, the one that resembles most Delacroix's original. On the right, we have the sleeper, almost entirely abstract. This really shows us the possibilities of paintings. It is a little bit as if Picasso wanted to try us to see which figure we give more credibility, which one we are more ready to believe. As Leo Steinberg again pointed out, the woman on the left, though naturalistic, is as flat as the Queen of Hearts on a playing card, whereas the sleeper on the right has as much volume as an origami figure. So what is it that we do believe when we look at painting? Is it the outline, the silhouette, or is it the volume, the third dimension? These kind of questions appear compressed in this one last and final painting, which also, according to Yves Alain Bois, was the tour de force with which Picasso ultimately came to terms with his grief over Matisse's death. Even though there was no version P, Picasso did not drop the subject altogether. It just evolved, like always with Picasso, to something else. What we have just seen, version O, was painted on 14th of February 1955, Valentine's Day, and some critics recognized Jacqueline's features also in the smoker on the left, the Queen of Hearts. What is definitely sure is that Picasso made no more oil paintings of Les Femmes d'Alger, but he kept on doing paintings of Jacqueline, also in Oriental or Turkish dress, like this one from 20th November 1955. It seems the coloring is very close to the Queen of Hearts in the version O. It now seems only that he is giving a naturalistic rendering and volume to Jacqueline. Interestingly, there is another painting of Jacqueline from 2 days later, from 22 November 55, where she is very flat. So this gives a complete inversion of the setup that we had in version O, where we had the naturalistic one in flat and the abstract one with volume. Here in this room we have a naturalistic Jacqueline with volume and an abstract Jacqueline flat. Also, regardless of Jacqueline, the Orientalist subject was something that Picasso kept on doing even very late in his life. In the late 1960s, 68 and 69, he has made 4 drawings that we have now in our collection. We presented here that shows either odalisques, according to their position, the flat one here, the one with more volume next to Jacqueline with more volume, or scenes of women with overstretched anatomies in a swimming pool or in the Turkish baths, which of course is a reference not to Delacroix, but to Delacroix's great rival in the 19th century, Ingres, and his painting of the same name in the Louvre. With this in mind, let's now go up and discover the second floor. On this floor, we will now discover what happened to the afterlife of the Femme d'Alger. What happened after Picasso has finished his series? One aspect we would like to present is how the paintings left Picasso and moved out into the world. The persons who bought all 15 paintings together were the American collectors Victor and Sally Gans. Kahnweiler had told them that they could buy the 15 paintings only en bloc. And even though they thought it was quite a high price at the time, they agreed and kept them only for a very short time, because they made an arrangement with the Seidenberg Gallery that they would resell 10 of these paintings of their own. So Victor and Sally Gans retained 5 paintings until their death and kept them in their living room in New York. As you can see here, quite an incredible constellation of these paintings all together. We admire also, of course, the detail that they gave with the Arabian furniture. On this table, we see, together with a few family photos, 2 works. For the benefit of our audience, we have presented them here in full size. So one is a print by Delacroix, Femme d'Alger, which was published in 1833 in the Gazette des Beaux-Arts as a supplement. And the other one is by Picasso and is from 1958, a painting after Cranach the Younger. So obviously the woman is the German Renaissance, but the dress, especially the colors, after seeing version O, we understand quite well how Victor and Sally Gans decided to put that into the living room among the Femme d'Alger.
It was also Kahnweiler who curated, together with Maurice Chardot and Picasso himself, the very first public exhibition of the Femme d'Alger. The series formed part of the 1955 Picasso solo exhibition at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris. On the installation photo depicting 13 of the 15 paintings, you can see that naming the different versions after the alphabet from A to O stems already from this exhibition. What a spectacular view this wall must have been. A few months later, the series was presented in 3 German cities, in Hamburg, Cologne and Munich. There had been some Picasso exhibitions in Germany before, but the ones in 1955-56 were the first major solo exhibitions. Accordingly, the interest of the visitors was very high, as one can read in some press articles. In the following years, some major exhibitions in the United States followed. Then there was quite a big pause during the 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s, and it was not until this century that the series was shown again to a greater extent, but never again the entire series with its 15 paintings. All the happier we are to present more than half of the series after 60 years again in Germany, for the very first time in Berlin, by the way.
On this exhibition floor, we're looking at the afterlife of the Femmes d'Alger series. We have seen that Picasso painted his series at the beginning of the Algerian War of Independence in 1954. This is interesting because Delacroix made his version at the beginning of French colonial rule over Algeria. So the iconography of Femmes d'Alger moves parallel to the political situation. It took Picasso 3 months to create a series and Algeria 8 years to obtain independence. Do the Femmes d'Alger paintings openly refer to the situation in Algeria? No. But did Picasso do other works in relation to the Algerian war? Yes, he did. After the anonymous women of Algiers in his paintings, and this is important because Delacroix had taken down their names, Picasso made a portrait of one specific woman of Algiers. Jamila Boupasha was accused by the French police when she was caught of plotting a bombing attack in Algiers. She was imprisoned and tortured and raped by the French military, under which she confessed to what she did. Later on, with her lawyer Gisèle Halimi, she retracted and filed a counter file against the French army. This case is what we would now say became viral, and Simone de Beauvoir, the writer, also took on the case, and they published a book in which they assembled all the pieces of the case. Obviously here we had democratic France fighting a war in which human rights were not respected, and Jamila was only one of many cases, but maybe one of the most prominent ones. This committee asked Picasso to contribute, and he came up with this painting showing Jamila Boupasha defiantly looking at us like she did for somebody who did not actually give in. And it helped because this media campaign in '61 made that her death sentence was not executed, and after independence in 1962 she was released. This book over here also has Picasso's portrait on the cover and on the frontispiece.
Another Algerian woman, in a way connected to Picasso and the Femmes d'Alger, although in a very different context, is Assia Djeba. She was a famous feminist writer living in France who campaigned for the independence of Algeria. In 1980, she published a novel titled Les Femmes d'Alger dans leur appartement, with the Delacroix painting on its cover. According to her, Delacroix's harem scene stands for Orientalism in the colonial context, with the women condemned to wait passively inside, whereas Picasso, as Gabriel already mentioned, who took up the subject at the beginning of the War of Independence and therefore at the end of the colonial era, denuded and finally freed those women. Picasso freed the women. We were quite astonished and found this reading extremely interesting, as it shows how different the reception of Picasso's work can be, depending on the point of view. In today's Western society, it's hard, or one could say also nearly impossible, to read Picasso's series in a feminist light. Picasso takes up an Orientalist subject by undressing and distorting the women. We all know the discussions going on about his relationships to women and his often brutal depictions of female figures. For us, it was very important to include this reading of Assia Djeba in form of a book and a quote on the wall in the exhibition to open up the perspective and add a new layer of interpretation for the series.
This is a work by Jamel Tatar. Jamel Tatar was born in France and visited Algeria, the country of his parents, intensively in the 1980s, when he spent a lot of time there. In his paintings, he usually represents soberly clad persons in front of plain color backgrounds. Most of his paintings have no title, but this one does. It's called Les Femmes d'Alger. Painted in 1994, it was the time of the Algerian Civil War, pitting the government against Islamist guerrilla groups. Obviously, the role of women was pretty much discussed during these times, and Jamel Tatar, by choosing this title exceptionally for his paintings and these motives, seems to pay an homage to the women of Algiers. They're standing up, looking at us defiantly, holding their hands in solidarity, and by this also make a completely different posture than the women that we've seen in Delacroix or Picasso that are usually lying or sitting. Here they're standing up. Another contemporary work bearing the title Les Femmes d'Alger is this one by Mexican artist José Dávila. He further developed the subject iconographically already in 2016 when he made a series of 13 works based on Roy Lichtenstein's painting Femme d'Alger, which itself is a reinterpretation of Picasso's series. In that series, he progressively was cutting out individual surfaces until in the end only the outlines remained. His reduced and partially cut out response to Picasso's version L is extremely interesting because it also reminds us of behind glass painting, although this is of course made with high-tech printers. And Dávila's version is exactly in the same room above the one where we have Picasso's version L below us.
Alida Bourriette is a French-Algerian artist living in Paris whose works deal with gender roles in modern Arabic and Western society. In her photographic series Mémoires dans l'oubli from 2010 and 11, she took photos of women by staging them in an odalisque-like setting. But unlike the paintings of the 19th century, those women are not young, naked, and seductive. Those are real women with real stories. All of them have lived through the War of Independence and lost their husbands in this war. Bourriette's photographs are tribute to these widows' lives by inverting the voyeuristic structure of Orientalist depictions.
Like Alida Bourriette, Zulika Bouabdella is also a French-Algerian artist and her works often deals with gender relations in both Arab and Western societies. The title of the video is Les Hommes de la Plage 2. But it is not only because of the resonance this title has with the subject of our exhibition that we wish to present this work. It was filmed on a beach near Casablanca, Morocco, and shows many people enjoying themselves. We, as a viewer of this video, seem to be standing on this beach ourselves. And it is only after a while that we realize that it is only man. Like the other works in the contemporary section, this one also relates to the works we have seen before through opposite qualities. Here, it's a woman artist presenting us half-naked and eroticized male bodies. Here, men run and move around freely in front of an open horizon. And where is the woman? Bouabdella invites us to think how much has changed for women in public life in some North African countries since the time Delacroix visited.
I'm particularly pleased to present you this room, a room that we dedicated exclusively to the Algerian female painter Baya Mahieddine. This artist, born 1931 in a suburb of Algiers, is very well known in Algeria, but almost completely unknown in Europe. Only a few French institutions own her works. Baya's works depict women exclusively, never men. They all wear long, colorful dresses with extraordinary hairstyling. The single big black eye is also very characteristic. In one of the rare interviews that exist, she once stated that maybe she paints her mother over and over again, who Baya lost at the age of 5. Very early she began to make art while living with her French adoptive mother in Algiers. The gallerist Aimé Mac discovered her work during a visit in Algiers and organized a solo exhibition in his Galerie Mac in Paris in 1947. Baya is only 16 at this moment and for a short period quite a thing in the Paris art scene. The next summer she works at the ceramics workshop in Vallauris next door to Picasso, where the two of them met. In some texts on Baya's art and life, one can read that she's even the one who inspired Picasso to start the Femme d'Alger series. But there's really no evidence to support this. It is highly unrealistic, as they met only this one summer in Vallauris in 1948, and Picasso did not take up the work on the series until 6 years later. Nevertheless, we were totally thrilled by these outstanding gouaches by Bayer and decided to give her Women of Algiers room in our exhibition. We think her strong, colorful works are a nice counterpart to the other femmes d'Alger in this exhibition.
We have now seen almost 200 years of femmes d'Alger as a painterly subject, but also as much more, as something where history materializes. This is why Columbia University's Zeynep Celik had called it the lieu de mémoire, a realm of memory, as goes the historiographical concept. Les Femmes d'Alger is still inspiring artists and writers from ever-widening geographical regions. We hope that by presenting some of the most prominent works of Femmes d'Alger, we will not only delight our public, but also enrich the possibilities of interpretations around Picasso's series, the core of our exhibition. Let us finish by thanking the Berggruen family for their invaluable support, all our lenders for entrusting us with their works, and thank you to you for joining us.
Thank you. We hope you enjoyed the tour.